Hermione asked, a bit shocked at the scale of the twins' creation. "That's not all it did," he muttered, then held the parchment out to her. Taking it, she unfolded the note and her jaw dropped. "Oh, my," she finally murmured, letting the note fall to the table. In her hand were a stack of photos. "How did they manage this?" She flipped through the snapshots, then passed them to Harry. Taking them, Harry burst out laughing. The first picture showed Malfoy, Zabini, and Parkinson. Draco and Blaise had their arms wrapped around each other and looked to be singing passionately to each other. Pansy was clutching her stomach as she puked on them both. None of them seemed to be terribly upset over the fact that they were covered in vomit. The rest of the photos were similar, only with different people. The last photo was a wide shot of the common room. The floor, furnishings, and even the walls seemed to be covered in bile. Passing the photos to Ginny, Harry then reached for the parchment Hermione had dropped. "Well, according to this," he said a few moments later, once activated, "the orb was spelled to discharge a vapor into the Slytherin common room. 2 hours later, it started taking pictures." He shook his head. They apologized, saying that they could only get it to take 15 shots. "They then used Dobby to retrieve the orb. They developed the images today and sent them to Ron." He looked up at Hermione. "This is way beyond me. How did they manage to do all this with one little orb?" "You're asking me?" she blurted. She turned to Ron and scowled. "They tanked their owls on purpose." "Don't scowl at me," he shot back. "I had nothing to do with their owls." Muttering darkly about having a long chat with the twins someday, she ignored the laughter at the Gryffindor table as the pictures were passed around. Morning, September 13th. Snape stood quietly at the front of the room as the Gryffindors found their seat. Once the class had settled, he looked down his long nose and stared at them for a moment. "As half of our class is still absent, we will not be brewing PP potions until their return. As such, you are to continue reading Chapter 2. I will expect a report on what little information you dunderheads managed to retain from your reading by next Wednesday. Well, open your books and begin." Once they'd pulled out their books, he made his way to his desk and sat down. Putting last week's homework assignments from a drawer, he began his marking. Ron glanced up now and then to watch the professor. When the man began to squirm in his chair, he bit his lip and looked back down at his book. He wasn't the only one who was watching the professor. Eyes flicked back and forth between books and the professor often as the class wore on. When they were dismissed some time later, most were disappointed. The professor had shifted a bit in his chair now and then, but that was all. Walking from the class, Ron frowned in thought, trying to remember everything his brother told him about the spell he'd used. In the end, he could only conclude that he'd messed up his casting. At lunch, Harry and Hermione tried to console him. "I'm sure if you write Bill, he could tell you where you went wrong," Hermione said. "It can't be an easy spell. Eastern sand fleas aren't native to Britain after all." "Don't worry about it, mate," Harry added. "He's still stuttering, isn't he?" He looked up at the head table, his eyes finding Snape. The staff had returned to eating in the Great Hall yesterday at dinner. "Yeah," Ron said, somewhat cheered by that fact, as his eyes followed Harry's. Snape shifted on his chair several times throughout the meal. He and McGonagall spoke in low tones several times, and the deputy headmistress's expression became more pinched as the meal went on. As the students finished lunch and began to gather their belongings, McGonagall's patience finally ended. "For Merlin's sake, Severus, be still!" she snapped loudly. "I can't!" Snape cried, leaping to his feet. He hauled his robe up to his armpits and dug at the waistband of his pants. "It itches!" Obviously distraught, the man dropped his pants to his ankles, and his hands dove into his undergarments to scratch vigorously at his genitals. "Oh, Merlin, it itches!" Severus Minerva shrieked. "Remember where you are!" Dropping into his chair, the man stretched out his legs and continued to scratch himself. "The itch. It burns." Snape looked around and blanched. The professors were on their feet, staring at him in horror, while the students were pointing at him and laughing uproariously. When the light of a camera's flash went off, Snape leapt to his feet, removed his hands from his underwear, and slammed his palms on them. "Cable! Give me that camera, you little—" "Oh, shit!" He turned away suddenly and began to scratch himself again. "Merlin, make it stop! All students are to report to their classes!" Dumbledore yelled over the laughter. "Now!" he finally bellowed when no one moved. Once the hall was clear, he turned to Snape. He snapped. He was squirming all through lunch, Minerva said, scowling down at the man in question. Severus, Dumbledore asked, do you have an explanation for this? The man was too distraught to answer. He continued to scratch and mumble to himself. Sighing, Dumbledore reached up to stroke his beard. When his hand touched the smooth skin of his chin, he scowled. Damn it! I miss my beard! Let's get into the infirmary, Minerva, he ordered. Maybe Poppy can figure this out. 20 minutes later, Poppy stepped out from behind the curtain she'd drawn around Snape's bed and approached Albus and Minerva. Eastern sandfleas, she reported, shaking her head in disgust. And with all the scratching he's been doing, the skin is broke open and raw. Albus winced. That means a soak-in. He shuddered. That's right, a 2-hour soak in oatmeal and wintergreen oil, Poppy confirmed. Why does he need to soak in that? Minerva asked. Eastern sandfleas are nearly impossible to spot, the Mediwitch told her. They're very small to begin with, and they act almost like chameleons, in that they match the skin tone of their host. The soak is necessary. The oatmeal smothers them, while the wintergreen oil counteracts their chameleon abilities, making them visible so they can be plucked out. Why can't you just remove them with magic? McGonagall asked. Dumbledore shook his head. They're immune to magic. It's actually rather fascinating. Severus would beg to differ, Poppy said tartly. Minerva looked toward the curtained-off area, then back to the Mediwitch. But wintergreen oil in that particular area, won't that be painful? It's going to burn like dragon fire, she stated, and burn creams don't work on that kind of pain. You do realize I'm going to have to pluck him bald, don't you? What? Minerva gasped. Why? Eastern sandfleas are black, the same color as Severus's hair. To ensure I've gotten those not attached to the skin, the hair has to go. She turned to Dumbledore and raised an eyebrow. I understand, but it must be done, he told her. Poppy threw her hands in the air. You don't pay me enough for this. Can't you send him to St. Mungo's? I think it would be better to keep this as quiet as possible, don't you? Severus would be embarrassed enough by this, he told her sternly. Give her a raise, Albus! An anguished voice called from behind the curtain. I don't need an angry witch between my legs, you rotten bastard! Dumbledore flinched but didn't speak. Poppy's expression darkened. Fine, she snapped. But you owe me, Albus! You owe me big! Spinning on her heel, she marched to the infirmary's bathroom to prepare the soak. I think that's our cue to leave, Dumbledore said. Turning, he walked quickly to the doors. Minerva watched him retreat, then looked back at the door Poppy had disappeared through. Not a bad idea, she muttered. Poppy's going to be angry for days after this. Great Hall, September 18th breakfast. Ron slid into a spot next to Harry at the Gryffindor table, a scowl on his face. I see the Slytherins are back with us. Rumor has it they were brought back to the school 2 days ago. I guess they figure it's safe to release the snakes into the general population, Harry said as he reached for a platter of eggs. They still look a bit green, though. They do match their house colors nicely, Seamus said with a laugh. And their head of house is still wincing when he walks, Parvati pointed out. Ron grinned. Remind me to thank Bill for that. And I think we should all thank Colin, Hermione added as she buttered a piece of toast. I was one of the first down to breakfast this morning. It would seem our little Colin is growing up into a polite young man. He gave each Slytherin a present to welcome them back. What was it? Lavender asked. A wonderful picture of their head of house digging at his genitals, she replied, before taking a bite. Laughter rang out at the Gryffindor table, causing many heads to turn their way. Think they know we were involved? Harry asked a few moments later. That lot. Of course they do, Harry, Hermione told him. Even if we weren't, they'd still blame us. I wonder how long it will take them to try to strike back, Dean mused. Oh, I don't think they'll have much time for that, Lavender told him, pouring herself a second cup of tea. Harry stared at her for a moment, then looked around. Most of the Gryffindor girls were grinning. All right, what have you lot done? Us, Ginny asked, her eyes twinkling. Why would you think we've done anything? Because he knows us. The girls began to laugh. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Just then a shriek came from the Slytherin table, and people began turning and standing up to see what the commotion was all about. Millicent Bulstrode shrieked again, jumped to her feet, and began yanking on her robe. The robe appeared to be shrinking in width, though not in length. It wasn't long before the girl resembled a rather lumpy sausage. Finally, able to get hold of the wayward garment, Millicent ripped it from her body. Reaching out, she grabbed the table to steady herself and began to pant. The Slytherin girls moved toward her, concerned, while the boys began to snicker. Everyone froze when she began to shriek once more. "Merlin, I hate being short," Ginny muttered, unable to see over or around all the people standing to watch the spectacle. In frustration, she finally climbed up on the bench to get a clear view. When Millicent began to grab at her clothing, many people groaned. No one wanted to see her without clothes on. Their wants didn't enter into the girl's mind, however, as she ripped the constricting garments from her body and stood buck-ass naked in front of her schoolmates and the staff. Moving quickly, her friends did their best to shield her nakedness from prying eyes, while her male housemates began to make lewd comments about Millicent's hidden attributes. "Neville blanched. Well, there's no accounting for taste, I suppose," he muttered. "Merlin, I'm never going to get that image out of my mind." He shuddered and turned away. "I wouldn't just yet," Hermione murmured to him quietly. He looked at her oddly, ready to ask what she meant when several more shrieks bounced off the stones of the great hall. "I'm going to be deaf soon if they keep doing that," Ron groused. "Now, what's the problem?" Snape had started moving towards the Slytherin table, but had stopped to gape when, one by one, the girls in his house began to pull and yank on their robes. "A little privacy, if you don't mind, Headmaster," Snape bellowed as he moved quickly towards the Slytherin table. "What?" Dumbledore asked, bemused, as he watched the girls begin to rip their clothing off. "Albus!" Minerva snapped. Receiving no reply, she cast a sonorous charm on herself and stood on her chair. "All students are to leave the hall immediately. Get to class, all of you!" The students began to gather their belongings and move towards the exit, many walking backward so as to watch the now naked, weeping girls as Snape tried to shield them from prying eyes. The Slytherin boys, it was noted by many, were the last to leave. Their gawking, laughing, and lewd comments actually caused Snape to issue a mass detention for every male in his house. Once the students had left, Minerva whirled to face Albus. "You randy old goat, you will stop staring at those poor girls this instant." "I was just curious, Minerva," he mumbled. "An intriguing spell, isn't it? Leave, Albus," she thundered. "As you're obviously no help, get out." Shaking his head as though trying to clear his mind, Dumbledore looked down at her. "You don't honestly think I was ogling the poor dears, do you?" His eyes twinkled, though his expression was one of hurt. "You're a pervert, Albus." "Now do as I said. Severus and I will tend to this." Sighing, he turned away. "No one understand me," he murmured. At lunch, many of the girls from other houses had converged on their Slytherin counterparts, offering sympathy. They also planted the seeds of distrust and dissent. Standing near the doors to the hall, Hannah Abbott, a prefect in Hufflepuff, patted Daphne Greengrass on the shoulder and shook her head. "For what it's worth, the girls of Hufflepuff tore into our male housemates last night. We're pretty sure they didn't have anything to do with the prank, but their behavior was appalling," she said scathingly. "House rivalries aside, common decency should have sent them out of the hall as soon as they realized what was happening." "I have to agree," Lisa Turpin said as she joined them. "And I can assure you that no boy in Ravenclaw had anything to do with this. Much like our Hufflepuff sisters, we made sure of that. That just leaves Gryffindor." Daphne spat. "Well, it's just something we heard," Lisa said hesitantly. "What have you heard?" Millicent asked as she pushed her way into the group. "Give me a moment, Millicent," Susan said as she stood on her toes and looked around. Spotting who she was looking for, she waved. "It might best if you heard it for yourselves." A few moments later, Eleanor Brownstone and Laura Madley, two third-year Hufflepuffs, joined them, looking a bit nervous to be among so many upperclassmen. Susan smiled reassuringly at the younger girls. "Would you tell Daphne and Millicent what you heard this morning?" Laura's eyes widened, and she looked ready to bolt. "It's all right," Lisa said, trying to calm her. "Just tell them exactly what you heard. Despite what the Gryffindors would have you believe, the Slytherins are not monsters. Just to be honest, Eleanor glanced at Laura, who still looked scared, and took a step forward. Laura and I were some of the last to leave the hall this morning. Someone had kicked her bag over on their way out, and it took us a bit to gather her stuff. When we left, we walked past a group of boys, and they were talking about what had just happened in the Great Hall. They were laughing about it, and several of them were begging two of the others to teach them the spell they used on you. One boasted he was going to use it on his girlfriend the next time she got above herself. Frowning, Eleanor looked at Susan. "What does that mean, anyway?" Susan smiled. "I'll explain it to you later." Millicent's face resembled a thunderstorm. "And who were these boys you saw?" "I don't know their names," Eleanor said. "Could you point them out?" Daphne asked quietly. "We could try," Laura said. Turning, she looked towards the Slytherin table and starting pointing out the boys she'd seen. "Eleanor confirmed her choices." "Thank you both for your help," Lisa said. "You should both get back to the table before lunch is over," Susan added. Nodding, the third years turned and walked away. Susan looked at Daphne and Millicent. "The girls told this to me between classes. I've never known them to lie, but I'm not sure if the boys in your house are capable of doing something like this. Slytherin doesn't mean stupid." Millicent snapped. Lisa sighed. "I don't think that's what she meant. Look, I don't know how things work in your house, and I'm not asking to know, but the guys in Ravenclaw would never think of pranking the girls in their own house. They'd know we'd find out it was them, nor would they do something this cruel and mean-spirited to their own housemates." Susan shrugged. "In any case, you now know what we know. Use the information as you see fit. I'm going to get lunch before class starts." She walked towards the Hufflepuff table and waved at Hannah, who was saving her a seat. Nodding to the two Slytherins, Lisa turned toward her own house table and walked away. "What do you think, Duff?" Millicent asked as she watched the two girls rejoin their friends. "I'm not sure, but something Eleanor said keeps going through my mind." "What's that?" Daphne looked at her and cocked her head. "How many times have we heard Draco tell Pansy that she was getting above herself?" Millicent's eyes narrowed, and she looked at the boys seated at their table. "Harper, Vasey, Urquhart, Malfoy, Crabber, Goyle, and Nott. Turpin was right about something else as well," Daphne added. "This little prank was cruel and mean-spirited. It also took planning. Let's face facts, Millie. The Gryffindors are more likely to change our hair color or hit us with stink bombs at the spur of the moment. They seem unable to plan anything. They just act on impulse. That's why they always get trounced so badly." She looked at the boys sitting at the table. "No, this took planning to pull off. No Gryffindor is capable of something like this." "We can't let them get away with it, Daphne," Millicent growled. "Nor will we. Come on, let's go talk to the other girls." The next morning, not a single Slytherin boy showed up for breakfast. The fact was not lost on their head of house. Standing, he approached the table and spoke with Pansy for a moment before leaving the hall. "Wonder what's going on there," Dean said as he watched Snape leave. "You were right," Hermione said to Parvati, who sat across from her. Lisa and Susan got it done. She slid a galleon across the table. Parvati scooped up the coin and grinned. "Now we just have to wait to find out what happened." Ron looked between the two, then turned to Harry. "Am I the only one lost here?" Harry shook his head. "No, I would say everyone not of the female gender is as lost as you are. But don't worry. The girls will tell us when they're ready." "My, aren't you blazed this morning?" Siamus remarked. "I thought you and Ron would be demanding answers from them." "Do we look stupid to you?" Ron asked. "Anger that lot if you want. I like my head where it's at." Dean laughed. "I think he was hoping you'd walk into the line of fire so he didn't have to." "Something like that," Seamus muttered. "Look," Ginny said quietly, pointing at the entrance to the hall. Snape had returned and was rushing towards the head table. Once there, he leaned down and spoke with Dumbledore for a moment. The headmaster stood abruptly and said something to McGonagall and Flitwick. "Merlin, I hope the Slytherins aren't puking again," Neville said. As Snape, Dumbledore, and McGonagall left the hall, Flitwick stood on his chair. With the help of a sonorous charm, he announced that classes were cancelled for the day. He flicked his wand to cut the spell, then climbed down from his chair and gathered the other teachers. A moment later, they all moved towards the doors. Hermione's eyes narrowed as she watched Daphne Greengrass stand up and walk to the Ravenclaw table. She stopped next to Lisa Turpin and spoke with her for a few moments before returning to her seat. Lisa's expression was blank, but her eyes were wide with shock. Standing, she walked quickly to the Hufflepuff table, where she spoke quietly with Susan Bone. When she was done, she returned to her own table and spoke with several of the girls there. "I wish they'd hurry," Lavender grumbled. "It can't look too obvious," Ginny said as she pushed her plate away and folded her arms on the table. "Here comes Luna now," Hermione murmured. "Thanks for letting me borrow your notes, Ginny," Luna said, holding out a piece of parchment. "My bag was infested with three-toed glitterbugs, and they left so many tracks on my notes I couldn't read them." "Three-toed glitterbugs?" Hermione asked, then regretted it. Luna nodded. "They're only visible by moonlight during a leap year." Ginny rolled her eyes. "Glitterbugs? That's the best you could come up with?" she asked quietly. The blonde squirmed a bit. "I was in a hurry. Deal with it." Turning, she returned to her table, shaking her head. Ginny looked down at the parchment. She froze for a moment, then quickly slapped her hand over her mouth and shoved Luna's note at Hermione. Taking the parchment, Hermione's lips quirked. "Oh, my!" she said, then bit her lip. "Mind sharing," Harry said. "It seems the girls of Slytherin did a little digging into who caused their unfortunate wardrobe problem yesterday morning." "Oh! And who are the responsible parties?" Hermione looked up. "The Slytherin boys." Ron frowned. "But didn't you tell us last night that you and the other girls were the ones who—" He broke off when Hermione's eyes went flat and cold. Right. The Slytherin boys are responsible. How?" Dean looked between Hermione and Ron and shook his head. "So why are the Slytherin boys absent?" "Apparently the girls got revenge last night," Hermione told him. "For Merlin's sake," Hermione Lavender groused. "Get to the bloody point. What did the girls do to them?" Hermione stared at Ron for a moment. "Eastern sand fleas." Ron's jaw dropped. "No way!" Nodding, she held out the parchment. Ron snatched it from her hand, read it, then began to laugh. "Oh, Merlin, I think they've outsmarted themselves this time." "What do you mean?" Harry asked. Parvati blanched. "The boys will have to be deloused, which is a rather painful process, but the girls will, at the very least, have to be examined. You do realize they'll probably fumigate Slytherin House, don't you?" "Yep," he said cheerfully. Harry began to laugh. "If the girls end up having to be examined, they're just going to hate the boys even more, and the boys are sure to figure out that the girls are the ones who did this to them," Seamus said, his eyes wide as he realized what was happening. Dean looked at Hermione, Ginny, Lavender, and Parvati. He stood abruptly and bowed to them. "Masterfully done, ladies. Brilliant. You've just removed Slytherin House from the equation." As he sat back down, the girls all preened. Harry looked at Seamus and grinned. "Now do you understand why we do our best not to make them angry at us?"